Okay.
And if any of the panelists would like to intervene in between, then they can raise hands. After your permission, then we can just intervene.
Okay. Sure.
And I would request all our participants to make sure that their video and audio is on mute when you are not speaking. Okay. So now I would request Dr. Maram to moderate the discussion and start the program. Dr. Maram.
Thank you, Radha. First of all, I want to thank the panelists and all the others who are part of this webinar. A very important webinar because for a very long time we have been speaking about the need to achieve the sustainable development goals by 2030. That's the UN resolution, and all the member countries have accepted it. And one of the major parts in that is to also create collaborations with the private sector to be able to mobilize both their finances as well as their expertise. So in this webinar today, we have a very sterling global panel. And I'll start with Geoffrey Hamilton, who's chief at UNECE International Center of Excellence on PPPs. He also is chief of the Partnerships and Cooperation section in UNECE. UNECE has been working in the area of public-private partnerships for over 15 years, creating practice-based knowledge, challenges governments face in using PPP. Can you please turn off your mobile phones? Uh, they have been, UNECE has been working in the area of public-private partnerships for over 15 years, creating practice-based knowledge to address the challenges governments face in using PPPs to modernize infrastructure and improve public services. Geoffrey has been the driving force behind numerous international conferences, awareness raising workshops, and development of guides on best practice, including a guide on promoting good governance in PPPs, which received wide recognition. International Center of Excellence, which was established in 2009 with the pioneering efforts of Geoffrey, explores the best types of international public-private partnership projects and assists countries in implementing such projects. Thank you, Geoffrey, for being with us here today. Then we have Pratish Haladi, who is Principal PPP Specialist in the Asian Development Bank. Pratish brings over 15 years of experience in investment banking, management consulting, and operations in the infrastructure and communications sectors. As a founding member of ADB's Office of Public-Private Partnerships, he focuses on advising public sector clients on structuring, tendering, and closing bankable PPP projects, as well as supporting policy and institutional development. Mr. Haladi obtained his MBA from the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, US, and his MS and BS from Carnegie Mellon University in US. Diogo Faria de Oliveira, who is Executive Director.
No. Chetan.
Defining future options in Portugal. 27 years of experience in the water sector. Diogo, an independent water expert, is the founder and executive director of the firm Defining Future Options. At the Portuguese Ministry of Environment, Diogo is president of the management and support team of the National Strategic Water and Sanitation Plan 2020 of the National Water Council. At UNECE, he is the president of the affiliated International Specialist Center of Excellence in PPPs on water and sanitation. Internationally, Diogo has working experience in 19 countries in Europe, Africa, Middle East, and South America, with a long track record of bidding and managing water and sanitation PPP concessions. Diogo specializes in business valuation, due diligence, long-term sustainability, and cost recovery. risk valuation, negotiation, and establishing utilities. Togo has a degree in civil engineering with expertise in hydraulics, water resources, and environment from IST Lisbon, and post graduation in improving the efficiency and reliability in water distribution systems from Universidad Internacional Menéndez Pelayo, Spain. Adeyinka Amedi Yanda is a public policy procurement and PPP specialist, presently with Said Business School, University of Oxford. Adeyinka
Uh,
over 17 years experience with an established track record in public-private partnerships, privatization, government policy, donor relations, project management, private sector development, economic reform, contract management, institutional development, strategic policy analysis, analytical and operational work on projects and programs. She has spent last few years as a energy and agriculture infrastructure at the Presidency Infrastructure Concession Regulatory.
without much ado.
Can everybody please put the mic on mute? She has spent the last few years as the team lead energy and agriculture infrastructure at the Presidency Infrastructure Concession Regulatory Commission in Nigeria, developing, structuring, and facilitating complex PPPs or other forms of partnership involving commercial finance for basic service provisions. She has a bachelor's degree in agriculture economics from Nigeria, a master's in public policy and management from University of Manchester in UK, and she's currently enrolled for an MSc in major program management from the University of Oxford. Syed Afsar Uddin is a PPP policy advisor in Ministry of Finance and PPP Development Agency, Uzbekistan. Afsar is an advisor, PPP Development Agency and Finance Ministry in Uzbekistan, and he advises the Uzbek government on development of their new PPP program. He transformed Bangladesh to a leading emerging market PPP program, US $20 billion PPP pipeline of 55 projects, which is really impressive. He led Bangladesh to 2018 Government PPP Promoter of the Year at Asia Pacific Awards. He has over 20 years experience, both public and private sector, on PPPs, including advising and leading PPP programs, developing and implementing policies, and structuring transactions. He qualified as a lawyer before joining Her Majesty's government in UK as civil servant in their Fast Stream program. He was Chief Executive Officer, PPP Authority in Prime Minister's office in Bangladesh between 2012 and 2018. So we have a very uh, uh, panel today, and we hope that we will be able to have a very meaningful and comprehensive discussion on one of the most important aspects of PPP projects in the social sectors, namely risk. Now, the risk in any case is in the heart of any project, any private projects, public project. But in public-private partnership, it takes on a new dimension because here is a very new experiment where the public sector, which is namely the government or a public sector undertaking, which is driven by the objective of public good, inclusiveness, etc., marries the private sector objective of profit, and therefore to find a balance between the two and to see that risk is appropriately allocated becomes a very critical aspect. Now, whereas in the developing countries or emerging market, in the advanced economies, public-private partnerships have been in place for quite a while, and also in areas of what we would call social sector services, for instance, in water supply, sanitation management, and so on. And they have a good experience. The frameworks are very well established, and especially the financials are clearly defined. But in the developing countries, including the emerging market economies, the experience with social sector PPPs is sketchy, and it hasn't been very widely practiced. And we will see some of the reasons why it has not taken off. These include education, health services, and other similar social infrastructure activities that require the principle of equity in the services that are given. Now, the PPP projects, like unlike many other projects, are long term, and they are fixed duration, fixed cost, and have diverse stakeholders that make these arrangements very complex. The risks involved in PPP projects come mainly from the complexity of the contract, technical and financial specifications, performance guarantees, economic cycles over long concession periods, etc. It is interesting to see that whereas initially, especially before 2008, PPPs, it was assumed that if you designed a project, which was a public-private partnership project for a period of over for a concession of say 30 years or 25 years, you could have a fairly stable forecasting of how the growth in revenues will be, how the demand will increase, and based on that, you could create a fixed cost and very specific contract over a period of 20 to 30 years. But we have seen since 2008 that the economic cycles have shortened. The economic forecasting has become very difficult because of volatility and unpredictability in the economic system, and especially the financial sector. And these long concession periods, over the long concession periods, very often risks shift from one bucket, which is say from public sector, to the private sector and vice versa. And therefore, the kind of contracts that we had thought of, they are no longer functional. And we have seen that this in most countries. In India, we have experienced this, that a lot of projects have come under stress on account of the fact that they did not factor this volatility in the concession contracts. Now, the one issue which comes up again and again is that the payment to service provider is linked to quality of service delivery. And this is predicated on the maintenance of the asset. So the asset is maintained over 30 years, and it is expected that if it is maintained at optimum levels, then the service standards will automatically be met. But the problem which is arising is also that over 30 years period, the performance standards also change, because with technological changes and obsolescence in technology, the standards change. And therefore, to have a service level standard that you had contracted right in the beginning of a concession, they often become obsolete over a period of 20 to 30 years. And therefore, one would have to also factor in the need for revising the performance standards as the world moves into a more complex, technologically driven economies. So this is the other issue that perhaps we'll need to look at to see how we deal with this particular aspect of the changing paradigm of performance, and how is it that this can be factored in. Now, there are several other issues here, but one, of course, one of the big issues here is that how the
of knowing that
government policies also uh, cannot be fixed in time, because the demand of the people ultimately, especially if it is a democratic country, the policies are driven by the demand of the people. Now, in a country like India, for instance, where we have a very large rural to urban migration, the aspirations of the people change, and therefore their demand for the type of services they require also changes. uh, and this is why this again becomes an issue, because when the demographic changes are taking place, when people are moving out of poverty into what we would call some semblance of middle class, and prosperity is anticipated as we go forward. In fact, one of the objectives of achieving SDGs also is to tackle the issue of poverty and how to eradicate it completely. So if that is happening, then we also see the other issue, which is the change in aspirations of the people, and therefore how do we change the parameters of a service which was designed in the beginning. For instance, in India, we have a standard for rural areas, the water supply, because everyone doesn't have piped water supply and unlimited water supply. There is a standard of say 110 liters per day, per capita per day, to be supplied to the rural areas. But the moment in after 10 years, when these areas get urbanized, where the demand of the requirements of the people change, this 110 liters would have perhaps have to be changed from 4 hours a day. The requirement would be 24 into 7 water supply. So how do you factor into the PPPs these issues that create a volatility or uncertainty in the PPP environment? So I think that again is a very critical aspect. And finally, one aspect which I think we need to also continue to grapple with is the question of affordability. Some kinds of infrastructure, you can restrict access based on pricing. So for instance, if it's an expressway and you say that on an expressway only cars will run, you have already excluded a large number of people who do not own cars, and therefore the assumption is that if they own cars, then they can afford to pay the toll at a higher level for the maintenance of the expressway. It's possible. Similarly for airports too, because only those who will fly will be using the airports or the ports, and so on. But how do you deal with, say, in railways, which carry a huge number of poor people, migrant labor from one place to another, or in terms of water, when you give water supply to the poor, how do you create the affordability? How do you build in the affordability issue into it, and yet see that there is adequate financing that happens? And therefore, when we are also talking of financing, we also need to see how, how do we create with the present day situation in terms of institutional finance being squeezed in on account of capital adequacy and the Basel norms, which have made it more and more difficult for the banks or the financial institutions, where the shadow finance is now being nearly, kind of, there's an effort to eliminate it and move towards institutional finance, which is purely transparent and accountable. How do we then provide enough long-term finance and where does this finance come from? For instance, the capital markets are flush with liquidity, but then how do you tap with all the risks that I have enumerated? How do we attract capital market funds into infrastructure to be able to move the PPP agenda forward? So I will stop there. And I think we need to deliberate upon it. So I would initially first request if you could make your responses, say for 5 to 7 minutes each, and then we will get into a discussion, because I think discussion will bring out more richly the finer nuances of the issues that we have placed today for our discussion. So may I request Geoffrey to begin the kickstart the discussion, if I may use that term, and get the ball rolling. Geoffrey. Geoffrey, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, Arvind. Just to say, we've heard from you some very tough questions, and now we've got to get to some very serious answers. Let's let's begin with something that I think is very valuable, which are the Sustainable Development Goals. I've worked in the UN system for 30 years. I was very excited when the SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, were adopted in 2015. I thought this was going to be the brave new world of PPP. I've been very disappointed. And I've been very disappointed because the PPP model is absolutely crucial for the success of the 2030 development goals. No public sector, even of developed countries, have the sufficient funds to deliver on universal access on healthcare, renewable energy, IT, water, sanitation. It's not going to happen. Public-private have to be the way forward. And what we faced immediately after the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals was a universal criticism of PPP. The non-governmental organizations, and I'm sure you have them in India, but certainly throughout the UN system, everyone said, are you mad proposing PPP as a solution to the SDGs? It was almost as if they wanted to rewrite SDG 17, where PPP is actually mentioned. So we took it on ourselves with the member states of our Economic Commission for Europe to rebrand PPP, but to rebrand it in a way that was not cosmetic, but was really serious. And so we called it People First. You've called it SDG PPP. I think that's absolutely fine. We have called it People First with 5 outcomes, but basically putting sustainable development at the core of public-private partnerships with people, the main beneficiaries. Value for people rather than value for money. Broadening the scope of traditional models of PPP, and telling the public and private sector that they've got to raise their games. They have to develop a new mentality. It's not business as usual. The SDGs are about a transformation in the world to make it more resilient against climate change, more sustainable, poverty alleviation, as you've rightly mentioned. So this is it. It's raising the game and trying to get PPP integrated into countries specifically where there are going to be major problems. And these are the low-income developing countries where the battle for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals will be probably won and lost. And I think it's important to have, in this context, a concerted attempt to develop standards in PPP and in People First public-private partnerships. Standards, because we need transformation, so we need to do as many PPPs as possible. And when I say this, I see my NGO colleagues going apoplectic with fury that I'm saying, no, it's not just an option, it's a necessity to get the Sustainable Development Goals. You show me for different countries who don't have alternatives to public sector, what are the alternatives? If there aren't alternatives, go to the private sector. Ideal world, we go to the public sector. The stringencies we're under means we have to get these public-private partnerships, but change the mentality and make them go forward in a way. But that brings us to, so we have to improve the standards, make it a model, People First, SDG PPP, that is going to be mainstreamed and really absolutely effective. Now, one thing, Arvind, that you and I face all the time when we talk about PPP, and which has been totally failed by the international organizations, including the UN and the multilateral development banks, is capacity building. We haven't got that right. And in fact, I mean, even the World Bank, I think, has probably put the white flag of surrender up, because I think it's now said, well, we've given, and they provide magnificent documents, wonderful, sparkling documents on how to do PPP. And that comes out in their knowledge labs. Great. But we know that in capacity building, our governments need hands-on help to deliver effective projects and pipelines of projects. And that hands-on help is not being provided. We need to try and improve that, because all we're doing is getting one problem, solve it, one problem, solve it, and it's in a circular capacity building that's leading to nowhere. And once the government's officials get up to the skills required, they're off to the private sector within a blink of an eye. It's so important. So what we're trying to do now in the UNEC is look at new ways where the public sector is still in charge. You can't privatize capacity building, that's impossible, but you can look at public-private partnerships as a way of improving the capacity of governments to deliver. And we've got in touch, and I'm Scottish, as you probably know, but it's just pure chance. But the British, and particularly the Scottish Futures Trust, the PPP unit in Scotland, developed a capacity building program which allows a hub company, a public-private partnerships to be established, working under the government, under the PPP unit there, to deliver effective public-private partnerships. And I really hope that we can move the debate forward and try and bring models like this, which have delivered projects at municipal services and so on and so forth, and done it very successfully. And if we could transplant this formula, this hub company, or similar schemes into countries like the developing countries, where the hub company would be working under the government agency to deliver successful, effective projects, we would go, I think, a lot further. The last point I wanted to make was stakeholder engagement. I think one of the great ways we can lower risk is getting our consumers, our customers, our communities, our local citizens involved in projects, not rhetorically, but actually involved in them, even involved in the design, even involved in the operation and management of this project. We've tried to develop some guidelines on this with our evaluation methodology that we've done. But I think this could be a kind of game changer, and 3 cheers for democracy. I think it's extremely important, and India is a tremendously vivid expression of this, and India should be extremely proud for doing this. And I think if we can get the stakeholders involved, we're going to do so much for improving the risk-free environment that we're trying to achieve. So to sum up, I would say get the standards so that we can get a formula for PPP, a new formula for PPP that's more applicable to sustainable development goals. Get something on capacity building, such as the hub company, that really is going to make a difference instead of just going on and on talking about it. And third, see about new ways in which, and you're the master, you've done so much of these projects yourself in India, but how do we channel the ingenuity, the capacity of stakeholders, and including women, women too, women's empowerment, the way they have to be involved in the design of projects is also very important. At that point too, the stakeholder engagement, I feel that this is the cocktail of success that we could use as a basis for going forward. But I fear I've maybe not quite raised the, maybe I've kicked it off, but I don't know if I've answered all your very difficult questions right at the beginning. But that's my UN perspective.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Geoffrey. You have raised some critical issues. In fact, I will come back to you on some of these, including the issue of hub company, which is really interesting, and also about the standards. But before that, let me go to Pratish. So would you like to take us through how you or the Asian Development Bank look at some of these issues?
Yes, certainly, Dr. Mayram. Let me just share a few slides that I had made for this. Let me see if that will work. Is it working?
Yes.
Are people able to see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. No, thank you very much, Dr. Mayram, and thank you everyone for joining. I think, Dr. Mayram, you've raised some very, very important points. And to be honest, I think we could have a rich discussion around at least 7 or 8 of those, in terms of separate discussions, because they're very comprehensive, and I think we're very much worth discussing. I'm just going to go through 2 aspects here, which I think relate to social infrastructure and some of the points you raised. The first is on how we look at risks on PPPs, and maybe I'll provide a bit of a transaction perspective. My background is more in doing advisory for public sector agencies in executing on PPP deals. And then also I'll touch on the role of MDBs and maybe how MDBs can help in some of the aspects that you've mentioned. So with that, I just want to touch quickly on, why do public sector agencies want to do PPP? And I think that we've heard two reasons. The first one, of course, is to attract investment, to alleviate public sector burdens and things like that. But I also want to look at operational efficiency, because I think PPP, a key aspect of PPP, particularly in the social infrastructure area, is around how to bring in that private sector operation, innovation, and efficiency. So it's that know-how that from a structuring perspective, we try to make sure works, and to make sure that the incentives are aligned throughout the concession period rather than just at a certain part of it. So, we have seen studies where PPPs, if well structured, can reduce cost overruns and ensure that projects are delivered on time, which of course are very key to the objectives of the government agencies. I just want to touch quickly on some aspects of PPP where they're fundamentally different from traditional procurement. And maybe the first point is one that I will highlight, where because the delivery period is over the life cycle, we have to ensure that the risk allocation and the structure and the incentives are aligned throughout that period. So we don't evaluate based on simply the construction cost. We would size our bid parameter or optimize our bid parameters in tenders based on something that matters for the entire life. And I'll talk a bit about that shortly. And maybe I won't talk through all of this given the 5 minutes or so that we have. But maybe I'll just mention and the last point there on incentives, that it's about completing construction as soon as possible so that profit can start to be earned by the private partner from the operations. Now, I just want to maybe highlight how we look at risk allocation on PPPs a little bit. And there are several risks. And what we typically do when we advise public sector agencies on projects is to look at what are all the risks in the project and which are best allocated to the public partner versus the private partner. And the general rule of thumb in PPPs is to allocate a risk to the party that's best placed to manage that risk. And this varies quite a bit from one project to another and from one sector to another. And so that's why here I put examples of two sectors which I think are quite different. One is a port project and one is, say, a public school facilities management project. So the latter being in the social infrastructure. And there's several aspects of this that I want to go through. And we'll come back to appropriation in a little while, but I think that, the appropriation of something like an annuity payment is something that squarely falls with the government. And we'll come back to annuity payments in the context of social infrastructure shortly. But say on a brownfield port project where market risk is passed to the private partner, this is not as relevant. We always highlight to public agencies that the right of way and resettlement risk should be passed to the public partner because they are best placed to do that. And they also probably would want to manage that rather than to outsource it to the private partner. Now, possibly one of the most important aspects of the risk allocation here is in some infrastructure assets, you can pass market risk to the private partner. For example, on a port project or an airport. But on social infrastructure projects, we very often see that the payment mechanism is more often an annuity type of payment or an availability type of structure, which I'll describe very shortly. But what this means is that the government is effectively paying during operations for the service that the private partner is providing to ensure that the facility is available. Part of the benefit of that is simply that it allows for the public partner to maintain or to minimize the cost to the end users. So with that, this is just a quick overview of how an availability payment mechanism works. And I think it's a key aspect to a lot of social infrastructure projects. The private partner typically will not want to take market risk on, say, a health or a school project, or at least a public school project. And so they instead would be remunerated through fixed annuity payments or availability payments from the government. This also has the benefit of allowing the public partner to not have to raise those revenues through the market. So we recently had a situation in Uzbekistan where our client, the Ministry of Public Education, actually said, well, I want to do a school PPP project, but I don't want to have the end users pay because it's supposed to be a public service. And because it's a public service, the government will make the annuity payments. Now, as you can see, the annuity payments actually have to cover all of the costs of the private partner because that's the only source of revenue they will have. This includes coverage of their capex, fixed costs, variable costs, debt financing costs, and also their equity return that they would need in order to justify their investment. And finally, there are penalties for non-performance, which is a key aspect that I will describe shortly. Now, I just wanted to give an example because typically on these availability payment or type of projects, you have the fixed payments being made to the private partner, but at the same time, we have to ensure that incentives are aligned throughout the operations period. And this goes back to a key point you had made, Dr. Mayram, which is how do you align the incentives and how do you make sure that the service provision is properly benchmarked, properly monitored, and properly ensured throughout that operations period. So what we do is we set out in the PPP contract KPIs. And I'm just giving you the example here of a water utility. This has water and wastewater. I won't go through each of these, but let's take, for example, water pressure, which has to be above a certain level. So the contract will have this requirement. And if that requirement is not met, then there would be penalties to the availability payment. And that way, the private partner knows that there's a financial incentive and essentially a financial incentive for it to continue to provide that quality of service. And more importantly, the contract will also stipulate that an independent engineer should be hired to verify compliance with the KPIs periodically. So with that, I will just talk a bit about the role of MDBs on trying to help government agencies with this. And I can speak mostly about ADB since that's what we do, but ADB has a 4-pillar approach to PPPs. And I think this touches upon a lot of the aspects that you had mentioned. The first 2 pillars are more on the macro side, on policy, on ensuring capacity building and institutional building, legal frameworks and things like that. I mean, these are key building blocks of how a PPP agency or how a PPP program in a country can be successful. And then pillar 3 is project development, where we provide advisory and project preparation services. Again, one key aspect of risk allocation is to ensure that proper project preparation is done up front. And so we can support that through our transaction advisory and also technical assistance to public sector agencies. And then lastly, in pillar 4, ADB can provide project financing through our non-sovereign lending window and also provide sovereign guarantees through our sovereign window. So ADB has the ability to support public sector agencies across the entire spectrum and value chain of PPP development. There are a number of products that ADB has, and maybe I won't go through all of these, but I'll just touch on the 3.
Faster, please.
Sure. Sovereign guaranteed products and sovereign loans, and then non-sovereign lending to the private partner, and then PPP transaction advisory. So we bring these 3 together to really help our government agencies develop PPPs. Maybe I'll actually stop there and I can respond later through the questions if there are any on any of this.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. I think there will be, I mean, in fact, there will be several questions. You have brought to the table some very interesting aspects, especially the kind of work that the MDBs like ADB are doing. But before we come to the question, I would request now, Diogo, if you could please go ahead and give us your perspective on these issues. Diogo, can you hear me? Yes, please go ahead, Diogo.
Okay. First of all, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me for this interesting meeting here. I hope that at this time you can see my screen. Not yet. So let's see if I can share it. Let's see here. Share. Okay. So what I have to share with you is basically a presentation. Okay, so not yet.
Yeah, now it's come on.
Okay, great. So basically what I want to share with you is a presentation where I will go through why do we have to change the way that we are, well, doing business and looking at economics, finance, and, the relationship between governments and the private sector and the roles of PPPs. So first of all, I want to make a statement that my generation and the generation of my parents have done a hell of a job in damaging, well, basically our planet, not only humankind, but the planet. We have nuclear leakage and disasters. We have put lead in gas and drive cars with lead in it. We have put asbestos on our walls and ceilings, and we have opened a huge hole on the ozone layer. And now we have this greenhouse effect that we only are seeing the tip of the problems that it is causing. Actually, many people are calling this new era as the perfect storm, because we have this huge challenge that is climate change. We have the population growth in 2050. We will have 9.3 billion people, and 2/3 of these people will be living in the urban areas. So we have this huge urban planning challenge to how to manage cities that will support 6 billion people in the world with the climate change on it. So with droughts and floods and with extreme events of tornadoes, heavy rains, and so on. So this is a huge challenge. And now on top of this challenge, we have this new coronavirus with creating delays in procurement. So basically delays in infrastructure, delays in construction. We have supply chain interruptions, mainly in Africa, causing many problems, for instance, in water and sanitation with chemicals, supplies, and so on. We have unemployment, lax tax collections. Well, it's basically a new set of challenges on top of this agenda that we already have called the perfect storm. So basically what we have to do is we must do better than we have done up to now, especially the new generation, and we must be fast in doing it because there's no time here for us to spend anymore. So what is the role of PPPs in the middle of all these, challenging times? Basically, the first thing that we have to understand is that PPPs by itself, they are not a goal, an objective of a government. They are a tool that should be applied only if the private sector performs better than the public sector. Okay, and for this we have to assess the value for money and the value for people, as Jeffrey told us. So, in terms of objectives and risks, the role of PPPs as a tool for society means that the PPPs, the private sector, must prove to be better than the public sector in at least one of these matters, okay? They must be better in expanding network coverage, in the case of water, for instance, increasing quality of service, increasing operational efficiency, reducing cost of service, and basically assuring sustainability. So either they are better in at least one of these, or then the public sector is a better solution. Why? Because as Arvin said, these are complex contracts. So we should only put these complex contracts in force if they prove to be better than the public traditional services. And about risks, as Pratish already guided us, many risks throughout the lifetime of PPPs, and we know there's been PPPs for almost 150 years or so. Risks have been mitigated, okay? We have project risks regarding, well, overruns in construction, problems with the technology, problems with forecasting population and demand. All of these have mitigation measures in force that it is possible to put. The financial risks are known as well, from inflation, from foreign exchange rate, unforeseen investments. And again, we can put standby loans, standby equity, we can put swaps. There's a sorts of mitigating measures that that are available. And then for exogenous risks as well. So basically, there are some sort of risks that we can predict, but there are some sorts of risks that we cannot. And take, for instance, this pandemic situation and how it will impact the PPPs. It is absolutely unforeseen. I mean, how come should I, in my lifetime as a professional, would guess that this would come in the years of my life? We know that contracts have these force majeure clauses. Some of them predict pandemics, some of them don't. There are insurances for lost profits as well in some contracts, but in some other contracts there are not. We know that some private sector will demand for compensation for the public party. But the thing is, in this situation, no one wins, okay? The public sector has to understand that the private sector alone cannot bear the cost of this pandemic, and vice versa. So common sense is necessary here. And what about PPPs after this situation? Well, basically, what I have came up with in the last couple of months is that a little bit all over the world, PPPs start to be seen as a boost to economy, to help recovering the society. And many countries, including in Asia, already have in their governments new PPP programs to face the recovery of the economy after the pandemic. They should help closing the financial gap as well. So we need, there's not enough funds. For instance, in the water sector, $130 billion per year, every year, is necessary to comply with the SDGs. So PPPs can help here to close financial gap. And I know that more resilient PPPs will appear with more transparent contracts, with less blurred clauses, with less gray areas, more black and white contracts, okay? And I know that for a fact, I mean, when I say for a fact, is because now these became a concern that it wasn't there. So it is a concern for the private sector, for the governments, for the lawyers, and for the banks that PPPs will be different. They will be stronger, and partnerships for sure will be stronger as well. Well, for the last, let me just say that we are studying this in this International Specialist Center of Excellence, which is a partnership between the UNEC and the Portuguese government. So thank you very much for this moment. Thanks.
Thank you, Diogo. I think I find several of the issues that you've raised are areas that require a little more deliberation, especially the issue of more black and white contracts, as you call them, more specific contracts, as you speak of them. We will come back to it soon enough. May I request Adianka to share with us her thoughts on these some of these issues which have now been discussed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mariam. Thank you, everyone. Um, from my perspective as a public sector practitioner handling PPPs, I think that by committing to sustainable development goals, what countries are invariably saying is that they're pursuing progress on economic, social, and environmental targets in a balanced and probably, an integrated manner. So we know that SDGs are cross-cutting and quite ambitious, and therefore it requires a shift in how we work in partnership with the private sector, between the private sector and the public. So for us to do this, there needs to be more collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. Now, I'm sure we all know that with respect to regular, economic PPPs, even though from developing countries, we have had some measures of successful implementation of PPPs in the economic sectors. But for social sectors, we're still, in the learning process. And it's important that in order to enable the private sector to, achieve reliable returns, the government and the public sector must come in and be more aligned with the private sector's interest. So some of the solutions from our end is that I think that governments working with the private sector should come up with very stable regulations and policy guidelines that integrate SDG goals, people first PPPs, and make it more pronounced. Because right now we're just looking at economic ones, but how do we bring in social sector projects? That means we have to look at different components of our PPP programs or frameworks. I also think that, we should also have an alignment, to attract blended finance and as the panelists from the Multilateral Development Bank said, also multilateral development financing solutions to support this social infrastructure project. So we need to create, policies that are well aligned and are clear, and are separate from the more economically advanced projects. We should also look at situations where governments are also designing and implementing government-supported infrastructure funds. And that can make these social projects more affordable to the public and available, So government-supported infrastructure funds. And as a matter of fact, the Nigerian government does have an infrastructure fund, and our sovereign wealth fund, sovereign wealth agency actually has entered into some funding partnerships with health sector global participants to achieve PPPs in healthcare. So some type of funds from the public sector could also support, achieving sustainable development goals. I also want to say that, we should have, and I completely agree with the first speaker, capacity building is critical because public sector frequently struggle. So having specialist transaction advisory teams working with the public sector to deliver on the mandate is critical. And I completely agree. Governments should also think about dedicated teams that are experienced in managing and driving and implementing infrastructure PPP projects across, the nation, because frequently you train them and then they're moved to another part of government or they leave the government. So you have to have dedicated teams where the capacity is retained within government and it's not lost during the life cycle of the project. And so I just think that, when in also designing our policy document, we should make sure that it's integrated with the SDG goals. And, you look at the components for water, for renewable energy, and we make sure that we're putting in policies and guidelines that are sustainable, that are implementable, and can also achieve, universal healthcare coverage, water provision and sanitation, for countries. So that's just my contribution for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Arianka. And Afsar, would you step in now, please?
Thank you, Arvind. I'm going to share my screen, so just bear with me while I get this online. So it's great to hear from everyone. And in terms of my perspective, I would like to sort of maybe share my experience as a policymaker in terms of having worked in many different governments in terms of the sort of policy content. So I'm just can just check whether you can actually see my screen at the moment.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so in the next sort of 5 minutes or so, I want to sort of home in on so 3 questions, I think, Arvind, that you sort of highlighted in your talk, and so you asked me to sort of look into. And these include PPPs in the social infrastructure sector in terms of why don't we see as many as there should be. In terms of awareness about SDGs and incorporation of that in the policymaking, and then how do we ensure so commitment to SDGs in the long run. Now, in terms of why don't we see much PPPs in the sort of social sector, I think, Arvind, you did a very good summary at that, so I don't want to sort of repeat it in terms of that. I have sort of listed out some of the sort of features. I'm sure if we brainstorm, we can probably add another dozen or so reasons why there are difficulties. But perhaps I can just talk about my experience from an anecdotal manner in terms of what I faced when I was trying to develop a health sector project in Bangladesh. Now, the focus was economic infrastructure, it was power, it was roads, and so on. Health sector was actually not on the list of projects to be done under PPPs. And in one of my first conversations I had with the health secretary at that time, the first and immediate, I think, hurdle was understanding the notion of how can PPPs be delivered and how can we align this with the fact that in Bangladesh health sector, health services are meant to be free. So how can you bring in a private sector profit motive in delivering services in an area that is actually designed to be free? And indeed, I remember in one of the frustrating conversations I had earlier, I sort of remarked at one point that, so you are happy to not provide services rather than providing services at a sort of minimum cost to be paid by users. And that was sort of the whole mantra in terms of there's a different feeling that in social sector, there is a reluctance to incorporate private sectors because of the profit element in it and the impact in terms of cost and pricing. And the other issue is in some of the social sectors, there is a direct sort of interrelationship between the private sector providers and the users. So for example, hospitals or health services is one example. And in this space, there is a lot of public sector service, public servants involved, and it does create a very difficult, I think, cohesion in terms of making sure that they are speaking to the same script. So the many sort of challenges in terms of actually trying to get the whole mindset across in terms of why should government look at PPPs in the social sector, given the potential impact in terms of pricing. Eventually, we did do the project, and actually, it was well recognized. And the way we did the project was I actually used examples and case studies from other countries. I used the case study from India, Romania, and Philippines in terms of promoting the development of dialysis projects in Bangladesh, which is actually now in operation and running. So again, what Jeffrey said, and I think Adianke also said, I think case study capacity building learning is something that is pivotal in terms of looking at broadening, I think, the application of PPPs in the social sector. In terms of the next point, PPPs and SDGs. Tail end of 2015, early 2016, when the SDGs sort of came in, I was brought in, asked to come to the Prime Minister's office, and Bangladesh actually took SDGs quite seriously. It actually appointed in the PM office a principal coordinator on SDG affairs, and so he called me in and he said, "Okay, Saeed, we need to incorporate SDGs into all parts of what we are doing in government. So in terms of PPPs, you're leading this, so I want you to incorporate SDG into PPPs." So I was just sort of scratching my head in terms of thinking, okay, so how do I go about incorporating SDG into PPP? So I sort of looked into the different SDG goals and so on. And this is what sort of it came up at. When you look at the details, this is the comprehensive nature of the SDGs. It basically covers virtually everything. So as I went through the 17 SDGs and the 230 odd indicators, I sort of thought that actually any project I do in PPPs will impact on one or more of the SDG indicators. So, if I am to meet it, I can actually do a quite simple exercise of saying, okay, I'm doing a road project. It's going to have a positive impact in terms of economic growth. It's going to help to communicate, so contact and enhance communication between different regional parts. So it does strike positively on all the SDGs. But I just felt that wasn't actually what the exercise was about. There's something more that we have to do. So Jeffrey, who's one of the panelists here, he kindly invited me and a few other practitioners back in April, Jeffrey, if you remember, 2016. And we sort of got together in terms of brainstorming how to, I think, reposition PPPs for SDGs. And this is where some of the sort of discussion about people first PPPs sort of came out at. And I think that is the sort of main point. And again, I think I share with sort of Jeffrey, it is a bit disappointing that not much more has gone into it. So yes, it's focusing on people. It's value for people rather than just value for money. But what does it really mean? And UNEC has sort of highlighted accessibility, equity, efficiency, effectiveness, sustainability, and replicability as some of the features. But I think these need to be unpacked a bit more. There is much more, I think, support we need from academia and other parts in terms of how do you marry some of these value for people. I mean, what does it really mean? What are we trying to do here? And how does it get integrated within government's policymaking? Now, I believe the place where we need to make a change is actually how do we select and identify project. In the UK, we used to call this the investment case, not the procurement sort of case, but investment case. Which areas are we going to invest in? Why will we invest in it? And how will we actually deliver a better value to the citizens? And I think in most governments, this is the area that needs to be focused more. So the Ministry of Planning, the Ministry of Economy, these are the ones that they need to go into. And I think this is where the DFIs and the multilaterals do need to step in. I think there needs to be much more examples being given to government in terms of how do they integrate SDG components into the policy making decisions for investments. So I'll leave it there, but I think there's something around there that we need to talk about more in terms of developing. My last point.
Yeah.
My last point, and I'm not sure how much time I have left, but maybe 1 minute, is you asked me to talk about how do we ensure long-term commitment to SDG components. So in this one, I think, first and foremost, is focusing on a policy investment decision. It needs to be based upon evidence-based decisions so that they are actually not done for, I think, populist measures, but they're actually done for citizens' needs. And I think that's one of the views that we need to look at. The other thing is about, again, focusing on needs rather than asset creation. A lot of government investment is focusing on asset creation or asset enhancement rather than focusing on needs. Now, everyone has heard this statement that some of the largest companies in the world don't own any assets. So you got the Ubers and your Amazon and Alibaba and all these other entities. They don't own these contents or the assets, but it's actually a medium. I think we need to look at repurposing assets in government. Government is probably the largest asset holder in the world. each government, and we need to look at how do we actually reposition this. And I think in the world of COVID-19, it has shown that assets can be used in a certain different manner. And finally, in terms of long-term, yes, PPPs can help to ring-fence funding, but we need to look at development of specific PPP-based funding envelopes. At the moment, government's budgets are annual. They don't look at long-term funding, and therefore this does create a bit of uncertainty in terms of supporting availability payments long-term. So I think there's a need to look at government's budgetary systems so that they are aligned to supporting long-term PPP that are done on availability-based payments. Many thanks, Arvind.
Thank you, Said. I think that was, you brought in a practitioner's perspective very clearly. So let me quickly jump into a few questions that I have, and then we will go to the sorry, I think there was some, can you hear me?
Sure, we could.
Yeah, okay. There was some sudden glitch. Okay, Jeffrey, let me come to you because you raised a very critical question about standards. Now, one of the problems that we have been facing is that when the standards, I mean, there is a best practice, and of course, the best practice always comes out of an advanced economy or a developed country practice. But we have discovered that when best is the enemy of good. So when you have standards which seem like very, very difficult or require a very major change in the manner in which or the cost that entails, then very soon the governments kind of lose heart and believe that it's much better to go by your own government manner of procurement rather than go through the PPP route. So do you think that we also have been looking at setting of standards which perhaps is not keeping in view the capacity of the developing countries to adhere to them? And would it be better if we had some kind of a scale and incrementally we push them towards higher standards rather than setting the bar so high that they get dissuaded into going into that field?
Well, it's a, a very difficult question, but it's something that's really has to be, and also tremendous to hear people I haven't been in touch with for a number of years coming up with some very important points. So you've definitely, for me, made my time here very valuable and very useful. So thank you, and thanks to colleagues for all the good advice I've received. The UN isn't doing a great job on implementing the SDGs. It's not doing a great job too on incorporating PPP to make it the tool that is necessary. I was amused when Syed was talking to exactly the same point that we reached. When we look at all the 17 plus the various indicators, I mean, privately I've spoken with the World Bank. World Bank says to me, Jeffrey, these are wonderful things, but how do we operationalize them? And it's very, very difficult. And we know that we've got to scale up. We know that we've got to make an impact. We know we've got to transform the societies to do this. But isn't it? I mean, and we want PPP to play this, this role. But as you rightly say, how do we get standards to be applied effectively by low-income countries where the battle for the SDGs is going to be achieved? I think. I was going to answer your question whether we keep the standards at the top level or we give a little bit of leeway and say, no, you don't need to reach them if you're a low-income country. It's a difficult question. It's a slippery slope. Because I remember a long time ago, I don't know if people will remember this, there was a big debate on appropriate technology, whether the technology should be transferred to developing countries that was labor intensive, which was a kind of cheaper technology, because that would absorb the higher, the labor power in the developing countries. But what you were really doing was saying, no, you're going to have a low cost, but labor intensive technology. versus advanced economy, high tech. And that's not the road we want to go down. We see that countries like China, like India, for heaven's sake, have made great advances on technology and gone to an accelerating mechanism. So my view is we should be very careful on lowering our expectations on standards and try and have a standard that is reasonable, that we can expect all kinds of countries to deliver. I can assure you that when we were doing our evaluation methodology on scoring projects to see whether they were compliant with the Sustainable Development Goals, a work of around 3 years and many experts and grey hairs and all the rest of it coming out as a result of it. This question was one of the key questions, whether a better score should be given to projects in low-income countries. Like South London is not so bad, but South Sudan is quite difficult. Shouldn't the project in South Sudan get higher marks? It seemed to be self-evidently true. My goodness, the people from the European Union, from Spain and France, and say, oh, no, wait a minute, you're discriminating against European-based countries. So I think probably in the evaluation methodology, which still isn't finished yet, but we hope will be done soon, we gave a few more points to projects based in low-income countries where the risks are much higher, as you very well know. And I feel we just didn't really deal with that subject. So it's a very complicated one, but don't go down the slippery slope of easing the standards, because that's not the type of development I think that's in the interests of our low-income countries.
Okay, would any of the panelists have, Syed, would you have the same view, having worked in Bangladesh and now Uzbekistan?
I think, as Jerry mentioned, it is a slippery slope, but it does, I think, impact government's policy decision making, because on many projects, when we've looked at it, the choice seems to be that, okay, we can get this done at a slightly lower standard, and it'd be sort of more affordable, or we can get this done at a higher standard, it'd be a bit more expensive, and then the decision becomes whether we do it at all. And that's when it becomes a quite challenging decision for policymakers. Now, at the moment, because of the way most developing countries, the financing works, mostly has to come from abroad, and most of them have signed up to the equity principles or the World Bank or ADB standards, and therefore governments do actually tune up the standards to meet the international one. I mean, my take on this is, I think this is where the MDBs or DFIs can support government by giving some concessional financing. So I would say I think citizens of the world have the right to have the same rights, and there should not be a difference of value of human being depending on where you are. So I think the quality standards should remain at a sort of, the right level. But I think what we can look at is maybe the MDBs providing additional support to countries, developing countries, with concessional financing. At the moment, PPPs actually do not attract concessional financing generally, because usually private commercial financing that's coming. So perhaps that's a thought for other participants and panelists, or maybe Pratish can actually uncover that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Pratish, I'll come to you, but let me add one rider to the question that Syed has just given to you to look at, which is that, the multilateral financial institutions also have limitation. And as we have seen in the case of every country, you have a country limit that is put there even for sovereign lending. And for private sector lending, there's a country limit. So for India, for instance, the ADB now would perhaps have a country limit of, say, $5 billion or $4 billion a year. Now, $4 billion a year is not adequate amount of money which would be required for infrastructure development, especially so look at the medical, the amount of money which has gone into developing medical infrastructure since COVID has struck. So there is a limitation there. And when you bring in co-financing with the private sector, then the cost goes up. So do you see that really a kind of an answer to the question which Syed has raised, that we have very high standards where the cost of delivery is going to be much higher. And therefore, it is possible to mitigate some part of that cost by lower cost finance which is driven by MDBs for this purpose. Please unmute yourself. Yes.
Sorry, should I respond?
Yes, yes, please.
Yeah, I think just going to the question, I think you're absolutely right. There is a limited window for MDBs to be able to support. And to be very frank, in looking at the broader infrastructure needs, at least in Asia, I mean, even if you look at the total DFI funding envelopes, it's a very small amount, right? So the question really is, how can we use MDB support strategically? And here, I think it comes down to, if I have to fund a project, let's take a road. If I have to fund that project and the road is $300 million, should I take the whole thing from MDBs as a $300 million loan? Or can I creatively structure the project so that only maybe if $30 million of MDB financing is provided, say through viability gap funding, that will enable private sector participation on the road to come in. So now what I've done is I've taken a road that previously we may have thought can either be done just through private sector, but the private sector may not be interested because the project's not bankable. Or I could have done it purely through an MDB loan of $300 million. But now I'm saying with $30 million, I can make the project bankable through the VGF. So the MDBs have developed several products that actually, or at least ADB, which I can speak for, we have developed several products that actually allow us to, help make PPP projects bankable without stretching those limits. One example is the VGF I just did. In fact, Syed will be familiar that this was done on a project, the Dhaka bypass in Bangladesh. That was not done with the MDB, but it could have been. But effectively, a $27 million VGF made a $300 million project bankable. Other things that MDBs can do is we can provide guarantees. So if you go back to the annuity payment type of structure that I described earlier, one problem we often have on, say, municipal water projects is that the counterparty, being a local municipal entity, may not have the creditworthiness to make those payments. And so here, MDBs can provide a guarantee on those payments. Again, the MDB use is not funding the entire project, but funding just enough to let that project be bankable for private sector participation. This is increasingly an area that ADB has been very focused on, which is how can we bring PPP and our sovereign capabilities together to do things that either could not do on its own.
Okay, thank you. Diego, you have experience in 19 countries around the world, in Africa and all over the place. Have you ever come across this issue that the standards that you are trying to put in place are very difficult in the environment in which the country's policies are operating at any given point of time?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. Actually, this question and the question of pricing and the perception that the private sector is more expensive, they are linked together. Why? Because it is expected that a PPP will solve the problems within a few years that were not solved in decades or even in a century. Take, for instance, the water sector on a developing country. There are difficulties in delivering 24 hours per day of water and water with quality and in quantity. And it is expected for a PPP to come and to solve this. As we know, PPPs concentrate the capital investment in the first 5 years or in the first 7 years. So it is expected that a private operator will solve everything within 5 or 7 years. So the standards are put very high. For instance, deliver water 24 hours per day in quality within the next 5 years to, say, 80% of the population. This takes a huge amount of investment and effort, and then the price is necessarily higher. So the problem is when you're facing standards and when you're facing the need of imposing indicators and performance indicators and targets on PPPs, you have to be very realistic and very careful in putting them together in order to assure affordability. So at one point you have to compromise, delivering the service to all and delivering the service at an affordable value. For instance, let me say that in Angola, which is a project that I worked very recently, it was necessary to increase the coverage to the population and multiply it at least by 5. But at the same moment, the population was increasing, okay? And when you deliver water, the habits of this population change because they no longer go with the buckets getting out water from a fountain or a river, and they have their tap water. So the per capita water increases. So if you multiply more coverage with more people and with more consumption, in some places you have to multiply by 13 the capacity of water treatment plants, for instance. So again, my point is you have to be very careful when you attract the private operator in imposing targets, in imposing investment, because the perceived risks of these private operators are very high, especially on developing countries. So if they perceive a high risk, they just don't bid for that project, or they bid with a higher premium on it, so again increasing the price. This happens a little bit all over the developing countries, and it is necessary, on my opinion, before you step in a PPP program, and not a project, I mean a program for society, to plan it very careful, to gather data, to make master plans, to make forecast sensitivity analysis, just before you put on the tender. Because at some point you get the risk of having a deserted bidding procedure, or a bidding procedure that does not meet your expectations.
Thank you. Adrianka, let me quickly touch base with you. What are the you've heard everyone speaking about these issues, and consensus seems to be that while standards must be kept high, but we must try and see if we can mitigate the cost part of it through better financing models. How has Nigeria looked at these things? I mean, you have a long experience of working in Nigeria. Could you share some specific risk factors that affect PPPs based on your experience in, say, African developing countries? Would you have some thoughts on that?
Okay, thank you. So some of the challenges that we face specifically would involve things like delays in government approvals, government even giving guarantees or credits. We also have challenges sometimes with an imperfect legal or regulatory system, and then sometimes legal changes. Another risk that frequently pops up is public objection in the first place to the PPP. Of course, financing risk is always at the top of that. Political risk, changing government, administration, insufficient capacity of government entities, and sometimes poorly handled bidding systems. So I'll jump in to just quickly talk about some of the methods we have tried to create that could mitigate against some of these risks. So when we talk about delays in government approvals, we've tried to create a system where we bundle a lot of the activities to shorten processes. So a bundling of activities could help. And then you could also have single stage procurement processes. So that limits the number of times that you have to get approvals. Then for poor bidding systems, sometimes is capacity building, and a rigorous procurement process that is put in place. And of course, this process should include credibility, flexibility, and competition. To take care of things like legal changes, political risk, force majeure, of course, proper contract management, contract implementation, adequate allocation of the risks, identification of it, and then room for renegotiation of contract where available. Proper clauses on arbitration clauses that allow for effective arbitration. Those are some of the things we're trying to now instill in our PPP processes, our guidelines, to make it sustainable, manageable, and beneficial to both parties. For financing risk, like I mentioned earlier, we are trying to implement a viability gap fund that's supported by the government. And then we also, like I said, under our Sovereign Wealth Fund, there's an infrastructure fund that has been put in place to try to develop some infrastructure projects, either upfront financing to support the project, or we're still developing the guidelines for annuity type PPPs, because that's more complex in view of our budgetary cycle administration, which can be very complex and a bit tricky. Definitely to handle aspects of insufficient government capacity or poorly designed or prepared project, it's a really big issue. And we're constantly trying to reach out to multilateral development banks to support our ministries, departments, and agencies with adequate training and skills to develop projects, to identify them, and to manage the procurement process, including contract management. And so specialist advisory teams to support the entire process, and then proper front-end planning. So a lot of front-end planning with our planning ministry and coordinated efforts. We've done that also through PPP units that are established across all ministries, departments, and agencies that are interested in or have PPP projects. And then we have a framework where we're trying to coordinate all these projects amongst all of us. And then for imperfect legal regulatory systems, we're constantly updating our guidelines. We're working on our regulations. And as a matter of fact, we did engage a firm from India, IDEC of India, who's also supporting us with that. And the IMF also is supporting us, to develop, more extensive guidelines that go through the nitty-gritty. And then to just jump in and speak briefly on the aspect of, some methods to address, social infrastructure and standardization. I think some of the things we try to do is to put in place a phased approach.
Well, mobile is ringing. Can you shut it off? Can you put it on silent?
Okay. To put in a phased approach to projects when you're implementing them. So pilot projects, standardization of contracts, and viability gap funding can also support. So for developing countries, what you need to do is sometimes take it in a phased approach. So instead of saying you need to reach 80% or 100% at the same time, you can start with 40% and phase it through the life of the contract. And then also, you can also start, like, instead of 10 locations, we can say, okay, let's take it in one location in the first instance. So those are some of the ideas and suggestions and frameworks we put in place to manage the risks that could accrue from social infrastructure projects.
Thank you. Actually, because we're running out of time, I will quickly take two questions, but my request is the answers could be brief. One is this is from the audience. One is from Mr. Anil Suraj, and he's saying, he's asking this question, is not contracting for people first PPPs far more challenging? How do we approach and resolve disputes that are bound to arise between the partners in such contracts? Any of the panelists would like to take this question? Jeffrey, you have to unmute.
Yes, yes. Well, it is more challenging. I don't think. I mean, you're putting more responsibility on on project deliverers. As I say, the SDGs demand that we scale up. We raise our game, both the public and the private sector. I still find, although I'm gloomy about the UN response, Arvind, I still feel the private sector can be won round on this. I was reading some data about renewable energy companies, and now over a third in their annual reports refer to the Sustainable Development Goals as a guiding principle. How they guide, but they're referring to it, and that's very important. So yes, it's going to be more challenging to do that, but that's because we want to get projects making more of a beneficial impact.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Mr. Naran Setseg Purev from Mongolia. His question is, what is main measure to mitigate risks to deliver better service for PPP infrastructure? Any of the panelists would like to take this question? Syed, would you like to hazard an answer to this?
Yeah, sure. I think sort of in Potish's presentation, he did set out quite clearly in terms of the risk allocation matrix that one would look through. So I think, I mean, the main measure to mitigate risk is actually obviously looking at the risk mitigation matrix and then identifying who is actually better placed to address this risk. But let me just go a bit beyond that a bit. I mean, one of the key issues, and I think, Avi, you mentioned in the introduction, was about the long-term nature of PPP contracts and actually the evolving changes in terms of people's requirements, service standards, and so on. So there is this huge, I think, challenge in terms of how can you marry a long-term contract with these changing sort of requirements of the people. So, and the UK, I think you recall, had a huge issue in terms of lack of flexibility for PFIs, and it's one of the sort of main challenges that UK faced, that they had entered into long-term contracts which are not flexible. Now, the reason infrastructure projects tend to be long-term, one of the main reasons is actually affordability. Because if you are to pay your infrastructure back in a much shorter period of time, it does increase the cost of payment. But I think that is something that maybe governments should be looking at. Maybe they should be looking at actually delivering these projects on a shorter period of time, understanding that, yes, they will need to look at government availability payments being increased in order to pay for the assets in time. But what it does do is it ensures that your contract will not necessarily be out of sync with the prevailing social needs. And once the asset is back with government, they can obviously reprogram it and revise it. So I think that is one thing to consider. And just when I'm on, just one last point is, we did focus a bit about capacity building in terms of PPPs. But one thing I've always wondered is, why do we actually see PPPs as something that is different to what governments do? It's like an additional thing. It's something that's not part and parcel of the way governments work. I feel PPP should be one of the sort of different financial, fiscal instruments that Ministry of Finance have in order to deliver the investment needs of the country. So I think there's some work that needs to be done in terms of civil service, of integrating and embedding PPPs as part of the public procurement sort of, I think, guidance they give to civil servants, and should be embedded feature within civil service. It should not be an add-on. And I think this is one of the biggest things. It's seen as an add-on. That's why it's always easy to sort of, I think, shoot at. But I think it should be simply another arsenal in the Ministry of Finances. Thank you.
I think this is a very important point, and there's some work we did in India on this by trying to embed the PPP training in the fundamental training program for all civil servants, so that it's not specific to those who are handling PPPs, but this is like learning the governance skills, and this becomes part of that skill. I think it's a very critical and important program. So I'd like to thank all of you for this very rich discussion. I think we have had some very interesting discussion today. But I also see out of this webinar, we have been challenged with trying to look at some aspects more deeply. We'll need to do a deep dive in those, especially in terms of, and there I think those who have law backgrounds and who have been looking at these are practitioners in this, as well as those who are looking at assisting in capacity building and otherwise will have to do a little more thinking. And I think we will, in the next 2 to 3 months, come back with another webinar, which is looking at the aspect of a very rapidly changing environment and how to look at long-term contracts. And what is the kind of flexibility we can bring into it. We will specifically focus on that, and I hope that will add to our understanding of how we can do people first PPPs or SDG in SDG related projects more specifically, more effectively, and make it more attractive for the private sector. This includes the aspect of shifting risks. So how do we also create an environment where when at a particular point of time the risk can shift to the other party and vice versa, and how can we devise methodology to be able to adjudicate what are the circumstances in which risk must get transferred from one to the other. So we will go a little deeper into that perhaps in the next round of our webinar. But for today, Jeffrey, Diogo, Adyanka, Pratish, and Sayed, I really want to thank you very much for having taken time out and making this conversation so meaningful. We have recorded the discussions that have gone, and we will try and bring out a small record of our discussion and circulate it as a kind of a memory for us to be able to build upon when we go to the other aspects of dealing with the risk in PPPs. Thank you very much, and have a good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.